Okay, Virginia.
Thanks, Skip. Welcome to AV Geeks at the Hunt Library, not currently at the Hunt Library. I am Virginia Ferris, and this is our 13th semester of this series, partnering NC State University folks with Raleigh's AV Geeks to discuss vintage educational and classroom films. Skip Elsheimer, founder of AV Geeks, is an NC State alum. He has been, for the last few decades, collecting films made throughout the last century, mostly 16 millimeter educational, training, and other sorts of how-to movies. And he does an incredible job sharing them with the world. Skip currently houses over 36,000 such films at the AV Geeks archive here in Raleigh and shares them as stock footage for films and exhibits, as research material, and during public events like this one. So today's theme is Let's Talk About Animals, and we're very excited to welcome our guest, Dr. Nicole Welk-Jaeger. Dr. Welk-Jaeger is a postdoctoral teaching scholar in the Department of History here at NC State. She holds a PhD in the history and sociology of science from the University of Pennsylvania, and her work focuses on how capitalist ideals have transformed human and non-human bodies. Her first book will focus on US preoccupations with bovine bodies in particular, and the long history of American attempts to mold them into symbols of health and sustainability. And we're really delighted to have her join us today. So just a reminder that over 200 of AV Geeks compilations are available for checkout from the libraries, and you can also visit avgeeks.com or search for AV Geeks in YouTube or at archive.org. So I'll hand things back over to you, Skip, to kick us off.
Nicole, you could say something to say hello so we can see what you look like.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. Can you hear me okay?
We got it. We're
Awesome.
good. Zoom technology. We love it and we hate it. What I did is, based on your expertise and what you've been working on, Nicole, I picked 3 films from our collection that I felt like might bring up some interesting points. These are educational films. They're on 16 millimeter, and they talk about, 2 of them are made for kids, and talk about our relationship with animals, and historically, and also modern day, and modern day being in the early 40s. The last one is a weird kind of TV piece about whether animals can think or not. And so it's kind of lighthearted, but I feel like this is a good place to jump off. So the first one we're going to watch is Animals in the Modern World. And the modern world is more than 80 years old, 80 years from now. So what I like to do when we watch these films is kind of see like, wow, things are totally different now, or wow, they're exactly the same, or wow, we totally forgot about that. So hopefully this will bring up some things, Nicole, that you can talk about. So here we go. Let me switch windows and do all the things that I need to do. All right.
His belongings more easily. In the world about us today, there are about 500,000 species of animals, from the largest 4-footed beasts down to the smallest insects. Man has species. We indicate this vast number of species by this large cube. The species which man has domesticated is shown by this small cube. Most of these were domesticated by man before history began. We of today have greatly increased the number within each of these species of animals which man has learned through ages to use. Also, we have made specialists of domesticated animals. Even chickens are specialists. These white leghorns specialize in supplying us with that important part of our food supply, eggs. Other chickens are specialists in meat production. Here is one dressed and ready for cooking. The milk of animals such as the goat has furnished food for thousands of years in many parts of the world. Goat's milk is especially good for children. A more modern way of milking is found in this dairy barn filled with cows. These cows are specialists in milk production. This large Hereford is a specialist in beef production. Beef cattle are raised in vast herds on our broad western plains where grass is plentiful. After being fattened, they are shipped to huge packing plants such as this one in Chicago, where they are prepared for food under the most sanitary conditions. Here we see halves of beef inside a packing house. The meat can be kept for months in great refrigerators. It is then sent out as there is demand for it in refrigerator cars to all parts of the country. We are continually making new articles from parts of animals. These are some of the products made from cattle: suitcases, shoes, gelatin, soap, handles for cutlery, and even fertilizer. Another important food animal is the fish. Here we see fish being taken from the sea in great nets. They are used by nearly all of us for food. Fish are not an expensive food because they are easily caught and because we do not have to supply them with food. These fish will be put on ice and will be sent to people who prefer fresh fish. On the other hand, here are cans of salmon, which will be sent long distances, eventually finding their way into our homes. On many pantry shelves is found another delicious food, honey. Honey is furnished by a tiny animal, the bee, an insect which has worked for man for thousands of years. The bee, therefore, is called a friend of man. But some insects are harmful. This fly, for example, may carry millions of disease germs. The eggs of the fly are laid in filth and waste. Flies are found in almost every place where people live. From filth to food, the fly travels, carrying its possible load of deadly disease germs. In contrast to this enemy of man is the silkworm, another insect valuable to man and raised mostly in Japan and China. Here we see mulberry leaves being fed to young silkworms. The domestic silkworm would soon perish if protected and fed. The silkworm spins a cocoon when fully grown. These are heated and softened, and the tiny silk thread is unwound. Japan and China produce nearly all of the raw silk of the world, but most of this raw silk is sent to the United States, England, France, and Italy to be made into cloth. After a long journey across the ocean, the bales of raw silk are unloaded and are sent to factories. Here the silk is woven into cloth by large banks of intricate machines, and it comes out as the soft, durable silk cloth which people buy in all parts of the world. Other animal products, as well as silk, are important in the trade between countries. For example, wool from Australian sheep is sent to many parts of the globe, mostly to Europe and to the United States. Since ages past, sheep have supplied people with wool for clothing. After the wool has kept the sheep warm through the winter, it is clipped off with shears during the warm spring weather. Here we see several types of clothing which are made from the wool: baby's snowsuit, children's play clothes, particularly for winter wear, stocking caps and sweaters. a ski suit, a polo coat, and even a lumberjack's mackinaw. Shepherds have long used another animal, the dog, to take care of their flocks. Shepherd dogs are intelligent and well trained. Most dogs in the United States are pets, such as this tiny terrier and huge St. Bernard. Good hunting dogs are the result of long training and experience. They locate game for the hunter and will stand for long periods quietly pointing the direction of game. Dogs must be very intelligent and highly trained to act as guides for the blind. In many parts of the world, dogs furnish power. In Holland, they are used to draw small carts. Dogs are found in all climates. In the cold north, they pull sleds loaded with mail and supplies. These Lapps in far-off Lapland have found that they can use reindeer power to pull their sleds. On rough, steep trails, animals such as the donkey are useful for carrying loads. The power of the pony is better than that of the automobile for rounding up cattle. Cow ponies know their jobs almost as well as their riders. These horses are trained for the racetrack from the time they are colts. Racehorses combine power with speed. On the other hand, heavy, slow work is the specialty of these draft horses. In the deserts of Egypt and Arabia, camels are still the freight trains. In far-off India, we see the cow being used to pull a heavy cart. India leads the world in the number of cattle, and nearly all of them are used as work animals for power. The water buffalo is well trained to splash through the muddy rice fields of India where machines could not operate. It is estimated that today, nearly 4/5 of the people of the earth, as shown by the dark portions of the continents, still depend upon the power of animals to help them in their work. And today, perhaps even more than in ages past, people throughout the world depend upon animals as a source of clothing. And perhaps to an even greater extent, as a source of food. In many countries, however, the work of even the most powerful animals is being replaced with vastly more powerful man-made machines which do the work better. Untiring machines are proving greatly superior to the power of animals such as the camels in this age-old camel train, which still plod along the highways of the Orient.
All right. So Nicole, what do you think about that film? That film was 84 years old. It came out in 1937. Has the mod- Go ahead.
There's a lot going on in this film. And they kind of try to go over as much as possible of how animals are affecting humans in various different ways. I thought it was so interesting how they were talking about animals as quote unquote specialists, really speaking to how each animal has some kind of use value. They have some kind of specialty that's best for what their purposes are. So whether it be food for us through the beet production aspect and the milk production, speaking to their use for clothing, for transportation, and then even going into insects being vectors for disease. It really tried to encompass all. And what's fascinating about this is there's a bit that's changed, but a lot of this narrative is quite the same, how we talk about animals. It's always within like the repurposing for human benefits when we look at other films or other literature in this vein.
Yeah, it seems to come up, the value of an animal seems to come up a lot, or at least it did in the 80s when it was like, well, you can't log here because there's this slug that's going to go extinct. And the outcry was like, well, who cares about that slug? Nobody cares about a slug. Um,
Yeah, I mean, there's different value. We're placing different kinds of value depending. Speaking to like the 80s example you present, speaking to conservation efforts and taking care of certain animals that might be beneficial to the larger ecosystem. This is a different way of thinking about domesticated versus non-domesticated animals, particularly after the 1960s, thinking about DDT and Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, how various different chemicals are affecting ecosystems. I think there's a lot more narratives surrounding which animals, which non-human things are really important to keep us healthy. So this was done in 1937, you said?
Correct.
There's a lot that hasn't quite happened yet that might make us help us with framing this film, including going to one of the last points they were talking about, where it was clothing and needing this wool for clothing, needing the hides of cattle for clothing. 37, we're getting into synthetics, and DuPont is developing nylon, and it's certainly popular by this time, but it's not really until the post-war period where we're really seeing synthetic clothing take over the market. So the emphasis on silk, on wool, on leather is really interesting to note in this film. There's also the part where they're focused on the cattle production, and that's kind of closer to my area of expertise and was really interesting for me to kind of look at here. First off, the milking machines. Some places still use milking machines like this, but it's actually Amish farms that I see using these particular milking machines that go straight into a bucket like that. Most milking machines actually have a pipeline system that go directly into a milk tank now. It has everything to do with health and safety guidelines and also efficiency, speed of milking at this time. And then when you're looking at the beef cattle production, they go from grazing to meat packing plant, no in between. The feedlot is non-existent at this time, or at least it's not at the scale that it is today. So seeing this in 1937, you see the amiss of the feedlot isn't in the equation when we're thinking about beef production of the cattle at this time.
Interesting. Yeah, so the funny thing is, of course, this is made for kids, and the fact that we start off with a little boy who discovers a kitten,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't have room for it, but maybe they can take it to the farm, but they only accept useful animals at the farm. It's kind of fascinating to hear that. And it's a way to kind of start talking about the process, but giving kids a sense of what is useful and what isn't useful as far as animals, and to think about how animals play a part in your everyday life is interesting. And this next film we're going to watch actually is called Animals Useful to Man. And this one, again, we have a little boy who's walking around and learning about animals and how it affects their life, his life. So let's watch Animals Useful for Man. And I feel like this film, I don't have the year on it, but I feel like it was like 50s or early 60s. So let's switch over. Actually, I misspoke. This is called How Animals Help Us.
One Saturday in autumn, Jimmy was on his way to his grandfather's farm. Uh-oh. A rabbit. You know, getting to see animals was part of the fun of going to grandfather's. Usually, there were many to see. Rabbits, field mice, squirrels, birds of all kinds, and sometimes pheasants. Now, finding out about animals was fun to Jimmy. He knew that some of them are helpful, such as the little birds that eat harmful insects. But crows, farmers think of them as enemies because they eat the crops. Some animals are so very helpful that men raise them and take care of them. What's that? At first, all Jimmy could see was the grass moving. And then a kitten. A lost kitten. There isn't room for you at our home, thought Jimmy. Maybe grandfather will let you stay on the farm. But grandfather only keeps animals that are helpful. Jimmy knew that. So that was when Jimmy really began to think about the ways animals help us. Now here were grandfather's cows, and Jimmy remembered that every night and morning the cows are brought to the barn to be milked. Giving milk is the way cows help us. They provide us with food. That's the reason grandfather keeps cows. Have you ever seen a cow milked this way? Most of the cows are milked by machines. Well, the kittens certainly couldn't give milk. Then Jimmy saw the chicken yard. Grandfather keeps a large flock of chickens. They have a big yard and a big house. Do you know how they help? They provide food too. The hens lay eggs. See? Well, the kitten won't ever be able to lay eggs. Isn't there something it can do to earn its keep at the farm? Pigs. When the little ones are big and fat enough, grandfather sends them to market. They provide food. Just beyond the fence is the turkey yard. The turkeys are useful as food, too. Well, the kitten can't provide food, give milk, or lay eggs. But he is cute. Maybe he can be useful in some other way. After all, grandfather keeps other animals too. What about the sheep? Some people raise them for food, but grandfather raises them for wool. See the deep woolly coats? Sheep grow them for the winter. In the spring, the wool is clipped off. Then the sheep start growing new coats. The wool is made into cloth. So sheep help us by furnishing material for clothing. Then Jimmy remembered a trip he and his grandfather made to a neighboring farm, where another kind of animal is raised. Mink. They are hard to handle and can bite fiercely. But they have beautiful coats of fur. And that is why the farmer raises them. Mink provide fur for clothing. Well, the kitten had soft fur, but Jimmy hadn't ever heard of anyone raising cats for fur. He'd have to think of something. Now, right in front of Jimmy was a third way animals help us. But he didn't notice, because there was Grandfather. Do you know the third way animals help us? Jimmy was so excited about showing Grandfather the kitten and finding out if Grandfather would keep the kitten that he forgot about everything else. He's a cute one, said Grandfather. Do you think he can help around the farm? Well, said Jimmy, I know a good many things he can't do. He can't give us food the way cows do. Or the chickens. Or the pigs. Or the turkeys. He can't give us clothing as the sheep do. But couldn't you keep him anyway? Well, Jimmy, if you figure out how the kitten can be useful, it can stay. Then Grandfather went off to finish his work, and Jimmy took the kitten to the house to give it something to eat. On the way, he tried to think of other ways animals can be useful. Then he saw the horses again. Work, of course. And Jimmy thought about oxen that are used for work in faraway lands. And camels that carry people and things. They help by doing work. And Jimmy had seen the wonderful work dogs can be trained to do, to lead a blind man. Dogs. What about Pal, Grandfather's dog? He works. He guards the farm. And often he helps Grandfather herd the sheep or the cows. So Grandfather does keep animals that work. If only the kitten could work. Then Jimmy had an idea. He knew what the kitten could do to help about the farm. Do you? Of course, like most of us, the kitten will have to grow before it can do its work. But when it is grown, it will help. Have you guessed how? Out at the barn, Grandfather stores grain. And mice come to the barn and eat the grain. Now, do you know how the kitten will earn its home at the farm? How many other ways can you think of that animals help us?
All right, so that was, I believe, 1954. Similar film, different company, but completely similar plot as far as discovering a kitten on the farm.
Yeah, and similar narrative really focused on the useful factor of um, is this animal helpful? How can the kitten be helpful in this instance? Which I think this narrative is a lot more driving that home in this film than in the other one. Um, and man, his grandfather has a huge farming
Oh
operation,
yeah,
even for 54 chickens, turkeys, dairy cattle, hogs, sheep. It would have been not that this would have been rare during this time, but it's definitely form fitted for this film. So anyone who've seen this probably maybe have three of these animals on one farm would have been likely. It's much more likely nowadays just to focus on one animal. Um, and then the throwing in of the mink was really fascinating, and mink farming, because that's when thinking about animal welfare issues, you don't see there mink farms are still around, but it wouldn't have been publicized in a way like this if we saw a film like this today.
right. And the service animal aspect was interesting as well. And that certainly is a debate now about what is a service animal and which service animals are we allowing on planes.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of goes to what animal is useful. And um, I always, films like this and any discussions about animals actually say a lot more about us as humans than it says about animals. I mean, the whole narrative of this film is how can you be helpful? And it's not talking just about animals, it's talking about the kids who are watching this film about animals. Where is your place in the world? How are you going to be helpful? And with the debate over service animals and emotional support animals versus specifically trained animals for um, whether it be for those who are blind with those training programs, or they now have animals who are very good at helping people with diabetes and smelling when the sugar levels are fluctuating. There's a lot of debates over the use value of emotional support, and I think it speaks to the debates that we're having that are there need to happen about mental health and what constitutes a good healthy relationship with another animal or with other humans. So those debates aren't going to go away, but they definitely get latched onto certain kinds of animals, just like you see in this film where the kitten is kind of, oh, we're not sure if this is a useful animal. um, Actually, yeah, it's a useful animal in one narrative in this film, just as a boa constrictor or a pet snake could be a useful animal for another person. So something to keep in mind, certainly.
In your studies and research, did you ever map out the transition of farm animals which are allowed inside of a city limit?
Oh, yeah. So in the 19th century, that's when they start really pushing livestock animals out of city limits. And that has to do with them as vectors of disease, hog cholera, as well as issues with nuisance audiences. There's a great book by Catherine McNur called Taming Manhattan that speaks to this whole debate and these issues of pushing out animals. But but yeah, by the early 20th century, most livestock animals are really pushed out of cities, and you need special permits to have a livestock animal or a large grouping of animals together. So this is really, it's really come up over the last 10 years, I think, with people trying to keep chickens in their back lots in various cities, and that being a possible vector for disease issue, and a big question. So yeah, our relationship with livestock animals has changed dramatically. And by this time in the 1950s, it would have been mainly rural areas where you would have found livestock animals as it is today.
In I don't know how it was when you were in grade school and where you grew up, but did you have a class trip to a farm?
I actually grew up on a farm.
Well, I did too.
But it was really funny because every year there was a huge county fair that we had. And the elementary school every year would take all of the kids to the county fair to see all the animals. And they would be kind of an educational opportunity for everyone who didn't grow up on a farm. I was actually the odd one out of maybe one of 4 or 5 families in my class that grew up on farms. But those were educational opportunities to talk to farmers about the cattle. And yeah, you definitely get this like very similar narrative of the use value of animals and oh, how much milk can a cow produce in one day sort of narratives today, or when I was in elementary school, certainly still happening today, that you're getting out of a film like this.
Nice. What type of farm did you grow up on?
I grew up on a dairy farm.
Oh, you did? Wow.
I did.
In what part of the country?
In Pennsylvania, in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. That's why I did some work with the Amish. I was able to access the community through familiarity with the group.
Excellent. Any other points about the film that we just saw that you'd like to talk about?
Just if anyone's, there's a lot of scholars today that are thinking about use value of animals, not just in the emotional support realm, but also in service animals, but also thinking of pets and what are the place of livestock animals. If we go whole hog, to pull out a pun, on animal welfare issues, Richard Bollier has a great book called Hunters, Herders, and Hamburgers. And he speaks to issues of post-domestication, where we're thinking of what's the future of animals if we're not going to focus on their service value and their use value, because there are animal welfare concerns and questions and debates that are happening today around these questions, and definitely coming out of that film that we just watched today.
Right. I mean, and that's, certainly the ecosystem that's impacted by these giant factory farms. Mm-hmm. In North Carolina, it's hog waste lagoons, which is pretty horrible when those dams break and it just floods these rivers. It's disgusting.
Manure management is a huge, huge element of this, and you are certainly not getting that aspect of things from this 1950s film, which very much would have looked more organic. All of that manure would probably go back to the crops, which would then go back to the animals. So something to think about, certainly.
Interesting. So we're going to watch one more film, but if you have questions for Nicole about her research and what she talks about and is working on, please put it in the comments on either YouTube or Facebook. And this last film is kind of I don't know, I like to always have like kind of a goofy film. And this one is, again, it purports to be, it's called Can Animals Think? And it's part of this series that was shown on early television. And it has kind of a goofy narration that's played for laughs. But it's talking about some issues which are, animals and how do they think? How do they reason in compared to humans? And there seems to be a lot of discussion recently about the fact that we haven't given animals a break as far as thinking that we're the smartest ones, not realizing that, there's a whole other things that we haven't even studied. So here's Can Animals Think? And, again, this is really holds up a mirror to us on how we view animals, and it's less about animals themselves. So let me switch things over.
This layout is a labyrinth, a maze, and it's going to be used in a test to see how quickly an animal can find its way through it. Now the professor's finger is indicating the only possible open road through the maze. Those are all glass partitions that prevent a small animal from making any other progress through that labyrinth. There's food at the other side. Oh, it's a white mouse. Mr. Thin Whiskers, he's going to be the animal to make the trip. see, he goes sniffing along. He's hungry, and he's looking for food, and he's going to try and find his way to where the food is. And it's at the far end of the maze, as we know. Still sniffing. You know, the sense of smell is very helpful to animals. In this case, Mr. Thin Whiskers can tell where he's been, and where he hasn't been, too, by sniffing. He doesn't want to retrace his steps. That'd be lost motion. He isn't like the goofus bird that flies backward because it doesn't care where it's going. It only wants to see where it has been. Well, Mr. Thin Whiskers is really making progress. Pretty well along now. He's getting warm. Getting warm. Very warm. Uh-oh, that's the jackpot. He's got it. He wins the prize, an aromatic chunk of cheese. Yum, yum. Well, we let him try it over and over again, this trip through the maze. And the more often he tries it, the quicker he makes the right turns. Gets to know his way around. Over to the food supply and back to his shelter where he lives. The way he's going back this time, it looks as though he could do it with one paw tied behind his back and maybe blindfold, too. He's really in a hurry. Uh-oh, he just went back to get a pal. Well, look who's here. That's a crayfish, the first cousin to the shrimp and the prawn. We can call him Krusty because he belongs to the crustacean, like a lobster or a crab. Now, the professor is going to do a little balancing act with Krusty. You know, human beings have a sense of balance, or they should have, and the organs that keep us in balance are in our ears. Now, the crayfish has them in the antennules, and, or feelers, if you want to call them that. There's a little chamber. By the way, it's very much magnified, and it has hard particles in it. Ordinarily, the little particles rest on the bottom of that little chamber and tell Krusty the crayfish that he's right side up. Rest among those hairs that are really nerve endings. Now, the professor has taken out those natural particles and has substituted little metal particles for a definite reason. When he drops a magnet into the water, the magnet attracts those metal particles and they go to the top of that container, that chamber in which those metal particles were dropped. Well, that seems to tell the crayfish that he's upside down. So he turns over. Now he feels as though he were right side up. But as you can see, he's really upside down. It's the magnet pulling those little particles to the wrong side that confuses him. Now, when the magnet is withdrawn, the particles fall back to where they should be, and the crayfish turns right side up. It's all very confusing. Now we're going to watch a guinea pig try to figure out the quickest way to a meal. Now here are two partitions, swinging doors to them, and food is placed behind each swinging door. Only in one case it's covered, and the other case... Oh, well, look who's here. This is a guinea pig, George. He has more whiskers than George Bernard Shaw, who is also a vegetarian. Well, now George starts out. He's looking for food, and he makes his way across to... Well, he turns to the right. He's a conservative. Goes to the right and goes through the door marked O. Well, there's food there, but it's tied down under wire. He can't get at it. There's no profit in that, so a little bit disappointed, he goes out. Now he goes to the left through the door marked N, and he finds the Blue Plate Special, a fine vegetable salad. He's really sinking his teeth into. Well, we try it over and over again, and he gets used to going to the left through the door marked M, which means meal to him, because that's where he finds his Blue Plate Special. Now the professor, Mr. Mino, is going to pull a switch on him. The M, or meal door, is, and also the food is moved with it. Now, we'll see what George does about this. Well, he goes out and he goes to where he usually found the food, on the left. But this time, it's marked O, and there's no food in there. Well, that's really skullduggery been going on. According to the way George looks, he'll probably go home and write his congressman about that. But he's stubborn. He says, wait a minute, I know there's food around here somewhere. So he goes through the door on the right, just on a chance. He has nothing to lose, the one marked M. And there's his blue plate special again. And he's right up to his ears in that food. There it still is, through the door marked M, on the right. Well, the professor keeps switching backward and forward, but one thing is constant, and George finally finds it out. That M means meal. And when you turn him out, he looks around, picks the door marked M, and when he gets there, he knows he's on his way to his meal. He has it. Now you'll see different animals faced with the same problem, and you'll notice the different ways they react to it. The professor is cutting a hole in this wire here, and down along the wire you'll see a hen, Deborah. Now the professor strews a little corn under the eyes of Debbie, and Debbie looks at it. Good quality corn, she's hungry, she'd like to get it. There's a hole down the wire, Debbie only knew it. She's walking down that way, but let's see. No, she doesn't go far enough. She just wouldn't go that far from the corn. It has too much attraction for her. So she goes back and looks at it. And, well, I don't think she's going to solve it. She puts her neck out, but not far enough, and she's baffled. She's going to go hungry. She just can't solve this problem. Now we try another animal, a dog, a schnauzer, Fritz, the bone on the outside. He reaches for it. No, he can't get it that way. Well, zip. One dog, one bone. Didn't take him long to get it. Now we have a monkey behind the wire and a banana as the bait. That monkey is Wilberforce. That is, I call him Wilberforce. He doesn't necessarily answer, but I call him that anyhow. Well, his reach isn't long enough to get that banana through the wire. So he has to do a little figuring. Come on, Wilberforce, old chap, put on your thinking cap. Don't just sit there. Oh, now he has an idea. Yes, sir, he has an idea. And now he has a banana. It's just as simple as that for him. Oh, this is a chimpanzee. The keeper calls him Charlie. Charlie the chimp. Now, the professor has half a pear in his hand, and he lets Charlie sniff it. He teases him with it. Then the professor puts it under that middle jaw. Well, Charlie saw him do that, and he likes a bit of fruit, and he keeps looking backward over his shoulder to where the professor put it as he's dragged away. Uh-oh, what goes on? Why, the professor, the old Mino, has put a wad of paper under there. Now the keeper leads him back to the bench where he saw the pear hidden. Uh-oh, and he pulls up the right jar. Well, what does he get? Just a no-good wad of paper. Well, he looks under those other jars. He knew there was a piece of fruit around there somewhere. Well, by jingos. He's still looking. He's wondering what became of that fruit. He looks like a man wondering what became of last summer's wages. And he's still wondering. And so am I.
All right. So not strictly a science film, more of an anecdotal film about science and how smart animals are. Nicole, what's your takeaway?
Yeah, the title of this film was How Animals Think, or
Can animals think?
Can Animals Think? Yeah, there's a few reactions that I have. In comparison with the other films, one striking thing to me is the naming of the animals. You don't get the other animals named in the other films, and there's a specific narrative that's being pressed on here. And just George Bernard Shaw, that joke. Wilberforce, Thin Whiskers, Charlie, Fritz, Debbie the chicken, all named animals. And then the poor crayfish was never named. And this might have been not even consciously done by the narration, or maybe it was. Because what's happening with the crayfish example is they're aligning that crayfish going belly up with a biological reaction to this magnetic substance being replaced with the natural substance that makes the animal think that it's going right side up or upside down. So in ways, when you're watching that film, you're seeing that animal not get named and seeing a lot of description about why that animal's acting the way it does, and not so much personification that's happening with it as with the other animals. It's leading you to assume that animal does not think. It merely just reacts to the environment around it. And I found that really fascinating, listening and watching this film.
Yeah. And I guess that's the thing is, do we assign value to animals that we think are dumb?
Yeah, that is a great question. We assign some kind of value, but is it a companionship, or is it an animal that's close to us when it comes familially? The Wilberforce naming of that one primate I found really fascinating, because it immediately made me actually think of Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, who was part of the Darwin debates against Huxley. So Huxley Wilberforce debates, huge during when Darwin's Origin of Species was coming out, and for the narrator to name the primate Wilberforce and to acknowledge that kind of companionship we have with these types of animals was truly striking to me, and speaking to, we do align some kind of intelligence or problem solving or a personality that we see with animals with a value that maybe they can be saved, they don't need to be eaten, they can be companion species, this sort of thing. Because the chicken was also considered a dumb animal, even though her name was Debbie. She didn't get her food. They said, oh, she's just going to starve, which is quite interesting too.
Nice. Yeah, so that film was actually, like I said, was shown on television. It wasn't made for kids. It was general audiences, but also adults, which is why you had that, that little Wilberforce mention. Kids would not get that, but, maybe an adult watching it would say like, oh, that's funny. Ha ha. But and I have a whole series of those films, and they talk about the animal world. But this one was in particular interesting to me because of the idea that, can animals think? I mean, it doesn't really, I don't think 100% address this in the film, but it does bring up that question of, when we look at animals, do we think that they have similar mental processes than we do?
Yeah, the big question is, do they think like us? And if they do think like us, what are the implications of the relationships we have with them right now? If they do, because there's an ethical question that comes out of that. If that animal thinks like me and I think like that animal, if should I treat this animal as I would treat myself or another human? And so this question is, this philosophical question is really, it's important, and it's been tried to be solved through these scientific experiments, but it's still, there's a lot of suspension of how much thinking and problem solving is an innate animal thing, and how much of it is specifically special to humans, if at all. There's some really, this has been a debate with philosophers for quite some time. I think of Jacques Derrida's cat. I don't know if anyone is watching this is familiar with Derrida, but he has a whole discussion where he's wondering if his cat sees him naked and knows that he's naked and is like confused by this or not. But it leads into this like philosophical debate in his book, The Animal That Therefore I Am. Are we closer to animals? And if so, maybe our relationship with them should change.
Nice. So somebody had a question in the comments about, because livestock is your what you've been doing research on. Do you have any insights on the history of horses that were raised specifically, like Clydesdales or like war horses that were, selectively bred to serve a purpose? And you talked about post domestication. I mean, their job is done, and so what is happening to them now?
Yeah, so I'm not as familiar with horses, but I do know a little bit. One of the things to keep in mind is horses were seemingly replaced for transportation, but we wouldn't have gotten any of the transportation we have now without horses. Horses were the main mode of work for getting the railway system put together in the United States. And for a long time, automobiles had like a kind of hybrid horse nature to them. But nowadays, I've seen there are some farmers that still use horses. Like I've mentioned the Amish community a few times sitting here today, and they still use horses for work. They use mules, they use donkeys. So I don't think they're going away in the sense that they're still used for transportation for certain tourist relationships or certain lifestyle arrangements. But I think that there's just not as big a horse population as we used to have. It takes a lot of work and a lot of resources to take care of horses. They have flightier stomachs. They need to have a very strict hay and grazing diet. So all to say, as our horses are not going away, but our relationship with them has changed quite a bit, and it's seemingly more recreational on the grand scheme of things than it was in the past.
When that happens, when like a traditional domestic animal kind of transitions into something that is for show or for, do they become more expensive? Because, does it become something that's now very precious, and, somebody is raising this breed of this animal because this is, this used to be significant, like records, there were vinyl records everywhere. They were super cheap. Then they went away, and now they're coming back, and you buy a record for $35. Is there something similar to that with domesticated or post-domesticated animals?
Yeah, I would agree to that to an extent. It's a little different with animals because you're also taking care of a living thing, and that takes a lot of time and resources and care. It's a little bit different than speaking to artifacts and that kind of supply and demand, because you need also someone who's a dedicated breeder to keep those animals in reproduction. You could have a breed come back. There's actually some really interesting science and efforts to bring back rare livestock breeds to help better diversify the gene pool of particularly cattle and pigs and chickens, to ensure that if one breed for one reason or another gets sick and die off, that we have some kind of diversity to ensure food production. So there's a lot of this kinds of things happening, and these are expensive projects, but not necessarily because there's not as many of them, but the resources going into them, or it's not as much as resources going into other projects.
Excellent. Virginia has shown up, and I think that means our time is up. Nicole, thank you for your time.
No, thank you for having me. This was a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Nicole and Skip. That was a really interesting discussion and some fascinating films, as always. So everyone, remember to visit avgeeks.com for more information and check out those compilations when the library's physical collections are back open. Our next show is in a few weeks on Friday, March 26th at 3 p.m. again, and it is called Let's Talk About Air Pollution with Aransazu Lascarain, who is the Assistant University Director of the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. featuring a selection of vintage educational films about pollution and its effect on climate. So tune in then, and until then, you can watch previous AV Geeks events at the library, showing through the library's website. So again, thank you so much, Nicole, for joining us, and for Skip, as always, for a great discussion. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.